welcome to the special talk today. This is the series of developmental psychology talk organized by Faculty of Psychology, Chulalongkorn University. It's an honor for us here to have a couple who is involved in the work of developmental psychology, especially in youth and child development, and they have a short trip to Thailand, and I kind of steal them from their vacation time to do some academic talk. So please welcome Dr. Benjamin Oosterhoff and also Dr. Carol Oosterhoff for coming to this talk today and giving us a talk. So Ben, would you like to start?
Yes. Hello everyone. Can you all hear me if I don't use the microphone? Bailey, would you like me to use the microphone?
Yeah, please.
Oh, yes. Okay. Do we have something that I can use?
We have the one here. If you want to.
How about now?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm very happy to be here and to share with you my work on adolescent civic engagement and how the developmental processes that we know that typically happen during adolescence can be used to support youth civic engagement. So I just want to highlight two things before I get started. One is that this talk was designed to be accessible to a lot of different audiences. And so regardless of your training level, I hope that you can find this information relevant and meaningful. And regardless of your degree or discipline, I hope that you can find this information meaningful. That being said, if you have any questions or places where you would like me to clarify anything, please just raise your hand and I'll be happy to do that. Additionally, most of the work that I'm going to be talking to you about today was conducted in the United States. However, I did try to pull in as much cross-cultural work as possible, and much of this work has been done either in Southeast Asia or in Thailand specifically. So please keep that in mind as you hear my work. Okay. So to give you an overview of the progression of my talk, I'm going to start off by talking about a broad perspective on developmental psychology called positive youth development, and how civic engagement can both be an antecedent to and consequent of positive youth development. From there, I'm going to discuss some of the larger limitations of the field, and I'm going to present two studies that sought to address these limitations. I'm then going to end by highlighting some of the limitations of the specific studies that I discuss and talk about some of the future directions that I have moving forward. Okay, so adolescence is usually referred to as the developmental period between the ages of 13 and 18, and it's incredibly interesting. If you think back to when you were a teenager, I'm sure you can imagine that there were a lot of changes that were happening during this time. Socially, usually most youth experience and spend less time with their parents during adolescence and spend more time with their peers. So this is a process that we like to talk about as autonomy development. Additionally, there are a lot of physical changes that happen during this time. Usually, most youth undergo the process of puberty, which is something that we can all probably remember even if we don't wish to. But there are also very important brain development processes that happen as well. So we know that during adolescence, youth become less sensitive to reward, which makes them more likely to engage in a variety of different risky behaviors. So relative to other age periods, during adolescence, individuals are more likely to engage in delinquency or law-breaking behaviors. You're more likely to break the law. You're more likely to use substances such as marijuana, other drugs, or alcohol. You're also more likely to engage in risky sexual practices. So for many youth, this is the first time that they get to experience or explore their own sexuality. And so it's not surprisingly that as many cultures want to limit engagement in risky behaviors. And so a very long history of developmental research has sought to understand why do some youth engage in risk more than others, and how can we prevent that? It wasn't until recently when psychologists have proposed that this might not be the complete picture of adolescent development, that we can also consider adolescence as a period of time characterized by growth and opportunity. a time when youth have the ability to thrive and to really reach their full potential. This strength-based perspective on adolescent development has become known as positive youth development, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Positive youth development does rely on a lot of different things, but one thing that I want to highlight specifically is this idea that youth are going to develop most positively when there is a mutually beneficial relationship between themselves and their context. Now this is a really, really complicated idea, but I'm going to keep coming back to it throughout my talk. But the general notion is that when youth are in contexts that support their skills, strengths, and abilities, they're going to be more likely to develop positively. Based on this idea, I have focused a lot of my work on civic engagement. Civic engagement involves a variety of different behaviors, attitudes, and skills that are conducive of pro-social and political contributions to society. So when we think about civic engagement, we can think about volunteering, we can think about environmental behavior, and in democratic societies, we can think about voting and political involvement. And what's important here is that civic engagement is one type of behavior that benefits both youth and their environment. So if we think back to that mutually beneficial context, this is a pretty key candidate here. So much of my work has focused on the personal benefits youth receive from being civically active. And through this I've shown that youth who are more civically engaged are less likely to engage in substance use, so they use less frequently use drugs and alcohol. They're more likely to engage in physically healthy behaviors, so they're more likely to exercise, and they're more likely to have healthier eating habits. They have greater mental health, so they have lower levels of depression and anxiety. They have greater academic achievement, so they get better grades. And they're less likely to engage in delinquency, so they're less likely to break the law. And part of the explanation here is that civic engagement is thought to provide youth with a variety of different resources and benefits that are conducive to health and adjustment. And so some of my work has shown that part of the reason why civic engagement is connected to better health and well-being is because youth have greater access to social support, which we know is incredibly important for health. So you can imagine participating in different volunteering experiences. You're doing that with your peers. And that gives you an opportunity to receive support from your peers, but you're also doing that with usually a volunteer leader or an activity leader who is there to provide you with support as well. So this developmentally is very important for youth and can help bolster positive development. But civic engagement is not only beneficial for youth, it's also beneficial for society. And usually this isn't a point that I need to justify very strongly. Most people can imagine how and why volunteering is good for their community or for society. However, I think it's very helpful to consider how good is volunteering for your society. And there was a very clever study that was conducted where a gentleman had a very similar question. And so what he did was he sought to quantify the economic value of volunteering globally. What would happen if we paid all of our volunteers money for their time? How much money would it cost? Can we put a price on volunteering? And so he did this globally, and he found that the number was very, very large. So if we were to pay volunteers for all of the work they did in 2005, it would cost 1.35 trillion US dollars, which is about the equivalent that would rank 7th in terms of national GDP. So if volunteering was a nation, it would be the 7th richest nation in the world. Now, I found this incredibly interesting, but it also revealed some other interesting statistics about volunteering in Southeast Asia. First, 30% of the population in Southeast Asia volunteered at least once in 2005. That is the highest in the world among all of the other nations or all the other regions sampled here. If you were to pay people for their time for volunteering in Southeast Asia, that would be equivalent to a little over 2 trillion baht for 1 year. Now, part of the reason why this is so important is because this is an industry that directly benefits the less fortunate. And there are not that many industries that have economic value that directly or disproportionately benefit the less fortunate. So volunteering is one example. However, we can also think about how other types of behaviors have a very substantial impact beyond just the immediate community. So environmentalism has a huge global impact. If we can engage youth to be more environmentally conscious, they're not only helping the sustainability of their community, they're helping the world more broadly. Now, it's incredibly important to also consider, well, why are we focusing on adolescents? What is the social value of considering civic engagement among youth? And as developmentalists, we've learned that adolescent civic engagement leads to adult civic engagement. So adolescence is the developmental period when youth are forming the habits, the skills, and the abilities to become civically active, and they carry those with them throughout the course of development. One of the best, if not the best, predictors of whether or not you're going to be civically active when you're an adult is whether you were civically active when you were a teenager. So I feel like I'm taking a lot of credit in presenting something very new and important, but people have been recognizing this for a very long time, and not just researchers. There have been a variety of different organizations that have sought to better understand the political and social viewpoints of youth, so that way they can get a better handle on the issues that might be at the forefront of policy moving forward. A great example of this is the World Bank conducted a survey about 3 years ago in Thailand that asked youth to report on what do you hope for Thailand's future. So they are directly targeting youth to get a better understanding of what are the issues that we see on the forefront of social policy moving forward. From this study, which they had a little over 500 youth participate in, access to quality education was on one of the highest issues that youth raised. Reconciliation of political divisions, so coming together politically, was another issue. Effective laws and democracy. And the World Bank was not the only one. The United Nations Development Program has also reached out to youth in the Bangkok area to better understand the political viewpoints and how to engage youth in facilitating democracy. And this, just as a note, was in 2015, so this was about 3 years ago, where they brought youth to the United Nations building to understand their perspective. So overall, I just want to really highlight that civic engagement is one way that we can create a synergy, a mutual beneficial relationship between youth and their society. And as we know, earlier civic engagement leads to later civic engagement. This can continue and spiral throughout the course of development if we can engage youth at an earlier age. So unsurprisingly, that's been a lot of the nature of my work, is what leads to adolescent civic engagement. And so I'm going to present you a very complicated model that's very familiar to us as developmental psychologists, but I just want you to know, don't worry, I'll walk you through it. So this is called the ecological model of development. And really what this is showing you is just a way of thinking about how different contexts can support healthy development in youth. You can think about the context that you're a part of right now. How we all usually have a friend group, for instance. Peers is a very important context for youth. School for youth is incredibly important. Church, health services, and so on. So this is just a way of characterizing the different contexts that we have and thinking about how those contexts can promote or deter youth civic engagement. So my work has shown that the messages that parents communicate about what is important about citizenship and what your civic duties are connected with adolescent civic participation. So this is a really fun study that I was able to do where I drove around to rural homes in West Virginia, and I had parents sit on the couch and talk to their teenagers about what it means to be a citizen and what your civic duties are. And I want to show you a clip from this study really fast. Okay, I'm going to try to turn up the volume very fast.
Is it coming from the computer or something?
Does being a citizen mean you have to do anything? What do citizens have to do? Well, being a citizen, you have to like vote, you have to vote, and you have institutional relationship, help the community, you have to work, you have to pay taxes, you have to support family, friends, help others. I mean, it's not just, being a citizen is not just, like being a Republican or Democrat or whatever. It's being a part of the community. My view is being a part of the community, helping others. Oh, go ahead, you already know what to do,
So we learned quite a bit from this study. One thing that we learned was that people have a very broad view of what citizenship entails, at least in the United States. Additionally, we learned that the specific messages that parents mentioned during these conversations were associated with similar types of behaviors among youth. So there's potentially room for socialization here of what is expected of you as a citizen, and that may translate into actual behavior. We've also examined how schools can facilitate civic engagement through extracurricular participation. So this includes out-of-school activities such as involvement in clubs, and sports, and involvement in arts in the community. And what we found is that these are what are considered breeding grounds, or these are areas that do a very good job at teaching kids skills on how they can work with other people to address a problem. And that's very important for civic engagement. And we find consistently that involvement in out-of-school activities is associated with greater civic engagement later in life. We've examined religiosity. Religiosity has been examined both here in Thailand and in the United States, and they've consistently found that greater religiosity is connected with greater civic engagement and pro-social behavior, which may be a product of specific religious teachings that often encourage helping other people. And we've also examined how different current events can potentially shape adolescents' concerns about different social issues. So what you have here is on the right, you have a graph of adolescents' concerns about economic problems, and this data was collected from separate cohorts of teenagers each year from 1976 up into 2014. So these are different groups of youth. What we found was that we see these spikes or peaks in adolescents' concerns about economic issues during times in the United States that were characterized by high levels of economic problems. What this helps show is that youth are paying attention to the social issues around them, and those are affecting the types of issues that they view as being relevant. So although we've learned a lot up until this point about the antecedents of civic engagement, there are still some very important limitations of the field. First, we do not know very much about how civic engagement intersects with emotional and social cognitive development. These are things that show substantial growth across the period of late childhood and adolescence. And so to build a developmental theory of youth civic engagement, it's important to understand how these are connected. Additionally, most of our research has really focused on one or two different specific civic behaviors, and we haven't done a very good job so far of treating civic engagement as multifaceted, even though we talk about it as being multifaceted. And lastly, we don't know very much about how non-normative experiences or atypical experiences, such as being the victim of crime, may also promote civic engagement. So I'm going to present two studies that seek to address these limitations. The first study is going to focus on these first two limitations here. And really the goals of this study was to better understand how emotional and social cognitive competencies intersect with adolescent civic engagement. For the purpose of this study, we kind of defined developmental competencies as skills and abilities that show typical change across late childhood and adolescence. We selected two emotional competencies. One being emotion regulations, the ability to regulate and control your emotional experiences. Kara is going to talk about this in much more detail moving forward, so get excited. And so the idea here is that if you have more emotional dysregulation, it might interfere with your ability to help other people and engage within your community. We also examine empathy, or having just a concern for others more broadly. Many civic behaviors involve helping other people, so we thought that having greater concern may be very important for civic engagement. We also selected 2 social cognitive competencies. Future-mindedness, which is the ability to think about how your actions are going to affect the future. Many civic behaviors have long-term consequences for the future, and so being able to anticipate and think about what those consequences are may be important for civic engagement. And moral reasoning, or the ability to prioritize the welfare of other people over your own. Again, since many civic behaviors concern others, we thought that this would be very important. And the goal here is to examine how these developmental competencies are connected with civic engagement among youth. So we recruited 17 different elementary, middle, and high schools from 3 different regions within the United States. One was in urban California, one was in suburban Minnesota, and one was in rural West Virginia, where I was based at the time. From this recruitment efforts, we received surveys from about 2,500 youth, ages 8 to 20. Most youth were ages 10 to 18. So this was in the United States, it was 4th grade through 12th grade. Youth varied in their race and ethnicity and in their financial strain, so we did get good variability there. And for our measures, we focused on 8 different indicators of civic engagement. So again, we tried to get very broad. 5 of them were behaviors: environmental behavior, volunteering, informal helping, voting intentions. In the United States, youth are not able to vote until they're 18. And so we assess voting intentions to be able to include youth who are under 18. News consumption, and we included 3 different cognitive elements of civic engagement, including social responsibility values, or the importance that youth place on considering the needs of other people. Political beliefs, which is really whether or not youth believe you should engage in political behavior. And civic skills, including self-ratings of youth's ability to create a plan to address an issue. So again, we had these 4 developmental competencies: emotion regulation and empathy, future-mindedness, and moral reasoning. So I just wanted to show this slide so you can see how they were measured. Okay, so moving to our findings, we found that in terms of emotional competencies, greater emotion regulation was connected to higher informal helping, higher civic skills, and higher environmental behaviors. So the greater ability you had to regulate your emotions, the more involved you were in these activities, and the greater civic skills that you had. For empathy, we found that greater empathy was connected with almost every indicator of civic engagement except for news consumption. So the higher empathy that you had, the more civically engaged you were overall, except for news consumption. For the social cognitive competencies, we found similar patterns with future-mindedness. So the more future-minded you were, the more engaged you were across almost every civic engagement measure, except for environmental behavior. And for moral reasoning, we found that greater moral reasoning was connected with greater social responsibility, greater informal helping, and greater civic skills. So, additionally, we did examine whether or not these connections varied by different demographic characteristics. Were they moderated by grade, gender, race, ethnicity, or location? We didn't find any evidence of this, but I just wanted to point that out, that we did look at it and we didn't find any evidence. So the very broad conclusions that developmental competencies are connected with civic engagement in a very meaningful way. We found the most broad level support for empathy and future-mindedness. This may be because having a concern for others is a general trend that's found across a variety of different civic indicators. And also considering how these behaviors impact the future, it just might be a more general trend or pattern or theme that goes across many of these indicators. We did find greater specificity for emotion regulation and moral reasoning. I want to highlight that this doesn't necessarily mean that these are unimportant competencies. However, the developmental story may just be a little bit more nuanced. Overall, I think this provides a good foundation or a good initial evidence to move towards a developmental theory of youth civic engagement by placing it within a broader developmental context. There were some important limitations. This is self-report data and it is cross-sectional. And so we are going to need to be cautious of this moving forward and make sure that we at least get multiple reporters of some of these measures. Behavioral measures would be great, and to examine these processes longitudinally. Okay, do I have any questions up to this point? Fantastic. All right, so this study was meant to address these first two limitations. The next study I'm going to present is really meant to better understand how non-normative experiences can intersect with civic engagement. So we're going to focus down here. And so this is a study that was recently published in American Psychologist that examined the links between youth victimization, beliefs about government, and political participation. And so this study relies on a different idea called social contract theory. Social contract theory has been used by political philosophers and psychologists as a way of understanding how people interact with government. And the general idea is that as citizens, we have certain obligations that we owe the political system, so that we owe people on a collective level. And in return, that political system has certain obligations it needs to fulfill for us. Now, what these are varies based on the political system that you have, it varies based on culture, and it can even vary based on your perception. In the United States, theorists have pointed out that we as citizens forfeit certain freedoms, such as we agree that we need to obey the laws, and we perform our civic duties, which can include political voting, political engagement. And in return, the government is meant to provide us with some basic human rights, including securing our safety and liberty. So one of the obligations of government is to keep us safe. And my work has shown that in the United States, youth recognize this social contract. I have shown this through studies that have demonstrated that youth view that they're not allowed to infringe on the rights of other people, even if there are no laws preventing them from doing so. That youth feel that they're obligated to give back to the community and engage in politics. But importantly, that youth view that government is obligated to keep them safe. And so one question that I had was, what happens when this social contract is violated? What happens when youth experience criminal victimization? What happens when they're the victim of crime? Because for those youth, the government has failed to uphold the social contract and has not kept them safe. John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, some very famous philosophers, have proposed that when the social contract is violated, youth are obligated to withdraw their support from government and work to change the political system. And so I had two broad aims with this study. I wanted to know, how is youth victimization connected with adolescents' beliefs about government, with the hypothesis that youth who are victimized are going to be more unhappy or more discontent with government? And how does youth victimization relate to their engagement in politics? If John Locke is correct, we would expect that youth who have been victimized are going to be more politically active. Now, in approaching this study, I ran into a lot of really important methodological considerations. One is that national elections in the United States are held every 4 years, which means that some youth may not have the opportunity to engage in politics based on what year the data was collected. Additionally, we've found a wide variety of demographic differences in both political engagement and in victimization. And so I've attempted to address these limitations by using data collected from different cohorts of youth each year from 1976 until 2014. I've looked at both past political behavior and intent to engage in future political behavior among youth that haven't already completed any type of political behavior, and accounted for a very wide variety of different covariates. Okay, so data for this study came from the Monitoring the Future study. This is publicly available data, it's online. They collected a new cohort of youth, new cohort of 12th grade seniors each year from 1976, and the study is ongoing, which gave us a total sample size of about 110,000 youth. So the demographics are posted there. For victimization, there were 7 items assessing the frequency that youth experience different types of victimization within the past 12 months. These ranged from being physically assaulted with a weapon down to different forms of property damage, such as having your property stolen, for instance. For beliefs about government or discontent with government, an example, we had 5 items. An example question is, do you think some of the people running the government are crooked or dishonest? And so many of these just tapped in youth's beliefs about the performance of government. And for political behaviors, we had 6 different political behaviors. Voting, donating to a campaign, volunteering for a campaign, writing public officials, protesting, and boycotting. Again, we measured both intent among people who have not engaged in these behaviors and engagement in these behaviors as well. Okay, so I want to show you how I'm going to present some of these results. This is what is called a forest plot. And what you have is the dependent variable is on the left-hand side, and these are different beliefs about government. So different, the specific beliefs and then an overall score. The bottom line is the standardized regression coefficient. So we used hierarchical linear modeling for this study, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that later. But what you need to know right now is that as long as the effect is on the right side of the line, it's positive. And as long as the error bars don't encompass the line, which is 0. So in general, what we found was greater victimization was associated with greater discontent with government. This was consistent for each of the specific beliefs we examined, as well as overall. So this provides initial support for my hypotheses. However, we wanted to perform a variety of different sensitivity analyses to see how robust this association was. So we examined links between victimization and discontent with government across different forms of victimization. So we looked at the effects separately for property damage versus physical assault. In general, I would just like to point out that all of the effects are significant, all of them are positive. So greater victimization, regardless of the type, is associated with greater discontent with government. However, you do see a slightly stronger effect for physical assault versus property damage, which may be because physical assault is a more serious form of victimization than having something stolen. Next, I wanted to know, well, is this consistent for different subgroups of youth? So we plotted the effect based on whether you're male or female, under 18 or over 18, your race and ethnicity, parents' education level, political beliefs, rural versus urban community contexts, whether you come from a single parent family home or a 2-parent home, and your school track. Again, the overall take-home message here is that the effect is largely consistent across these different subgroups. Greater victimization is associated with greater discontent with government. We also plotted it based on the cohort from which the data were drawn, and the accompanying presidential cabinet that was in office at the time in the United States. And again, you see a great deal of consistency here in that the effect is always positive and always significant. Greater victimization is connected with greater discontent with government, regardless of the presidential cabinet that was in office. So now I feel a little bit better about these findings. What about political engagement? Again, so you have the political behaviors on the left and the standardized effect down. We consistently found that greater victimization was connected with greater political engagement among youth. When we examine the effect based on intent for political engagement, we find a very similar trend, where for most political behaviors, greater victimization is connected with a greater intent to engage in political action. Turning to the type of victimization, it's probably not too surprising at this point, but we found similar trends, that greater victimization was connected with greater political engagement regardless of the type of victimization that you experienced. Similar patterns for subgroup of youth as well, regardless of if you're male or female, under 18 or over 18, race, ethnicity, and so on, greater victimization was connected with greater political engagement. And regardless of the presidential cabinet that was in office, greater victimization was connected with greater political engagement. Okay, so I think what this study does a great job of demonstrating, it provides fairly strong support that at least cross-sectionally, the more victimization that you experience, the more unhappy you are with government, and the more politically active you are in the United States. It's important to note that this is very consistent with work that's been done in countries that have had recent political reforms and that have been stricken by war. So this has been consistent in Palestine, Palestinian youth. Brian Barber did some wonderful work there that has showed a very similar pattern. It's also been demonstrated among Venezuelan youth. So there is some evidence that this isn't just an American phenomenon, that this may be happening globally as well. I do think these findings have some very important implications for theory and policy. First, in democracies, I think that it demonstrates that we can consider treating victimized youth as an asset. In democratic nations, we want people to be engaged politically, and so we appear to have a population that is motivated. And so if we can provide opportunities for these youth to become involved in politics, we're going to be able to incorporate diverse perspectives and engage youth, which, as we know, will follow them throughout the course of development. But there are also some very interesting implications for clinical efforts that have worked with trauma-exposed youth, in which they have attempted to repair the social contract and facilitate more positive perceptions of youth's communities among this population. So what this is just demonstrating is, again, there seems to be a motivation for youth to become engaged in politics. If we can engage them, we may be able to facilitate a more positive view about the political system and help them with potentially post-traumatic stress symptoms. So for future directions, I think it's going to be very important to examine the explanatory processes that account for this. Do these youth actually view that government did not uphold their responsibility to keep them safe? Is that what motivated them to become politically active? Are there emotional processes involved in this process? So are these youth, does violations of the social contract spark anger, which motivates political action? I think that would be very important. And additionally, this is cross-sectional work, so we do need to model this longitudinally. Further, I think we need to show that political engagement may be beneficial for victimized youth. I do have some preliminary data that has examined this, and so far everything is coming out fairly consistent that, at least for self-esteem, youth who have been victimized, who engage in politics, tend to have higher self-esteem than those who have not engaged in politics. Okay, so I think more broadly though, this model has a lot of implications beyond just the work that we've done in the United States. I think that it's going to be important to consider what is the social contract in other cultures. How do youth view this social contract? How does it connect with their own form of engagement? So a great question could be, how do Thai youth view the responsibilities of government? How do they view their own responsibilities? What happens when government doesn't uphold their responsibilities? These are kind of transferable questions that can be asked across different cultures, and we may find some meaningful variation. So this is just a general way of saying that this may be a broader model to operate within that hasn't received a lot of empirical attention quite yet. Additionally, I think it does help inform a broader developmental theory of youth civic engagement by demonstrating that civic engagement is not only predicated by positive experiences, that negative experiences can also lead to civic action. And so right now, most of the work has been dedicated to understanding how context and experiences intersect with civic engagement. However, I think that this needs to be expanded to better understand how context and experiences may be dynamically tied to greater motivation and competencies, how motivation and competencies are dynamically tied to civic engagement, and how civic engagement is dynamically tied to health and well-being. And so there's a lot of room for growth here if we're asking the correct types of questions. Okay, so I would just like to thank all of the youth who have participated in my research. I'd like to thank my funding sources, and I would like to invite anyone here who has questions to contact me, or if they're interested in the subject, please contact me, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have right now.
We have the political democracy on hold in our culture, in our country. What's your, so the nature of our political situation is different from what it is in the US. So it's, I don't have a question, but I think it might be interesting to see, that we have, the ongoing change between military government in alternating with, kind of like every 4 or 5 years we change, political system at different times. So it would be interesting to look for more data on how youth react to the situation and how they feel like they would be more motivated to engage in civic issues.
Yeah. Absolutely. So the comment was that here in Thailand, the political system is very, very different than that of the United States, in that there are kind of waves of different political systems that are in place. And so how might that kind of fit in with some of the work that I've been doing? And I think that really it excites me a lot, because I think that it helps us. Most of the work that has been done in this arena has been with United States youth, and it really draws a very important limitation to that work. How can we say that these processes are general across human development? We can't. We can't say those things. We have to take the political context into account, and we haven't been doing a very good job of that. I'm not sure why. But it's something that I'm very interested in pursuing moving forward. I think that social contract theory would be a really interesting model to apply here, based on the drastically different and shifting political systems that are in place. There has been, I can recall one study that examined Thai youth's perspectives of democracy. And it was very interesting, because what they found was there were some similarities. There were, Thai youth recognized key components of a democracy, including a constitution, and idealized versions of what a democracy should be. But there were some very important differences, and I think that being able to integrate those differences within this model, we'll be able to get a better understanding of what these processes are like for youth more broadly. Again, social contract theory can be adapted to different political systems, because it's about youth's perception. It's about their view of what their responsibility is to government, their view of what government's responsibility is to them. There may be some consistencies. It could be that for youth involved in a lot of different political systems, they think that a very central responsibility of government is to keep them safe. But there may not be consistencies in other areas too. So for us to be able to actually examine that would give us a wider view of what these processes can look like.
I have two questions. Let me go back to civic engagement. In the empirical research, you show that future mind distant didn't connect to environmental behavior. But I find confused that when I do something for preserving environment, I often think of the next generation, but you show that it didn't connect. This is my first question. May you explain why? And the second question, how victimization shape our brain? Because you said civil engagement connect to developmental model, right? Bioecology, something. Yeah, and so it should imply that victimization shape our brain too, right?
Oh, okay, neurological changes.
Yeah.
Okay, yes. If I understand your question, I think the first question was we didn't find a connection between future-mindedness and environmental behaviors. Why might we have not found a connection there, given that there's a really intuitive explanation? That would be a very intuitive connection we would expect. So that's a very great question, because we were surprised by that as well. And in our explanation right now, one possibility could be that for young kids, especially where some of these kids were 8 years old, they were in 4th grade, many environmental behaviors could be rules that parents have. You recycle your paper, they might not connect that to this broader goal. So my explanation is that it might have to do with our measure of environmental behaviors, where we didn't disentangle whether or not kids are actually doing that to preserve the environment moving forward. Rather, we focused on this specific action. And so we can't unpack that with other family rules they might have. So we consider it environmental. We don't know if the kids consider it environmental. And that might be why we didn't find that connection. The second question is, we know that victimization can have neurological implications for the structure of your brain. In thinking about civic engagement and political action developmentally, how does that fit into the results that I've found and into the broader model that we have? Is that correct?
Yeah, right. Right.
Okay, I think that's a great question, and it gets into questions about what's explaining these effects. So in the trauma field, what we find a lot is that kids who have experienced trauma and victimization have a hypersensitivity to threat and to fear. And so victimization can contribute to emotional dysregulation. They're less able to regulate their emotions physiologically. And so if part of the motivation behind victimized youth to engage in politics could be anger towards the political system, it could be possible that experiencing victimization makes you more sensitive to your emotional motivations, such as approach, which might explain why you see a greater tendency for victimized youth to be politically active. There are a lot of assumptions that are a part of that explanation that have not been tested, so it's just my thinking about it, but I think it's going to be really important to test as we move forward. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
It is very nice that you can use the perspective of psychology to tie into these political questions that, mostly people think about it as a talk in political science group, but actually we can look at the viewpoint of youth development and how they think about their engagement in terms of political and civic engagement. So this is very nice talk, and thank you so much. And now it's probably the time for Dr. Oosterhoff. Sorry.